The church was full that Sunday morning. Every seat was taken. The praise and worship had ended 20 minutes ago, and now Prophet Daniel Adeyemi stood at the pulpit, his voice rolling across the congregation like thunder. People were on their feet. Some were weeping. Others raised their hands, eyes closed, faces turned toward the ceiling as if heaven itself was pressing down into the room. Then he stopped. Not gradually, not the way a man trails off when he loses his train of thought. He stopped the way a clock stops, completely, without warning, mid-sentence. The microphone was still at his lips. His eyes swept slowly across the congregation, moving from left to right, the way a man searches a dark room for something he knows is hiding there. The silence was immediate and suffocating. Someone coughed near the back. A baby cried briefly and was hushed. Nobody else made a sound. When Prophet Daniel finally spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "There is a dark shadow moving among us," he said. "I don't say this to cause fear. I say this because God has shown me. Before this month ends, many lives in this room will be severely affected unless something is done today." The congregation erupted. Women grabbed each other. Men shifted in their seats. An elderly woman near the front began to wail loudly, and two ushers rushed to her side. The atmosphere, which had been electric with joy only moments before, shifted into something else entirely, something heavier, something that pressed against the chest and made it hard to breathe. "Do not be afraid," the prophet said, raising one hand. "God always warns before he allows. Come forward, every one of you. Let me pray over you. Let me anoint you. What is meant to destroy you will pass over this congregation today." The response was immediate. People poured out of their seats like water rushing toward a drain. The aisles filled instantly. An enormous queue formed at the altar, winding back through the middle of the church, past the children's section, almost to the door. Ushers scrambled to create order. The church's worship band began playing softly in the background, something slow, something that felt like urgency dressed in melody. Madam Esther Johnson did not move. She sat in the fourth row from the front, her hands folded in her lap, watching everything unfold around her. The woman to her left had already joined the queue. The couple behind her had gone. Even old brother Festus, who used to complain that his knees could not carry him up and down stairs, was shuffling forward with surprising determination. And still Esther sat. She was not angry. She was not rebellious. She was not confused about what was happening around her. She simply could not move, because somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath the sternum, in a place she had no medical name for, a voice had spoken to her, not loudly, not dramatically, just once, quiet and clear, the way a person whispers something important directly into your ear. "Do not let him touch you." That was all. 4 words. But they landed with the weight of something she had never felt before in 31 years of attending church. The queue moved steadily. Prophet Daniel was praying over people quickly, a hand on the forehead, a word spoken, a brief press of oil from a small bottle his assistant kept refilling. Some people fell, others wept. Others walked back to their seats with expressions of deep relief, as if something heavy had been lifted. Esther watched all of it. When her row was finally reached, the usher gestured toward her. "Ma, please join the line." Esther stood. She walked toward the altar. She could feel eyes on her. Several members knew who she was. Madam Esther was not the kind of woman people overlooked. She had donated the chairs every person in this building was sitting on. She had funded the renovation of the children's block. Her name was on a plaque near the entrance. She reached the front of the queue. Prophet Daniel turned to face her, his right hand already rising, oil glistening on his thumb. Esther stepped back. The entire church seemed to inhale at once. Prophet Daniel's hand stayed suspended in the air. His eyes met hers. For exactly 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then a slow smile crossed his face, practiced, patient, the smile of a man accustomed to resistance, and he lowered his hand. "God bless you, sister." he said softly. Esther nodded once, turned, and walked back to her seat. The murmuring began before she had even sat down. Esther Johnson was 54 years old and had built everything she owned with her own hands. Her husband, Charles, had died 11 years ago, a cardiac arrest that took him on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning and no goodbye. He left behind a struggling printing business, 2 employees, a rented office space, and a wife who had never managed accounts in her life. Most people expected her to sell everything and move in with her brother's family in Abuja. Instead, Esther had sat at her late husband's desk for 3 days, gone through every file, every contract, every unpaid invoice, and then stood up and decided she was not going anywhere. 11 years later, she owned 3 companies, employed over 60 people, and was one of the most respected businesswomen in the state. She drove herself to work every morning. She prayed every night. She gave generously, not because anyone was watching, but because she believed it was the right thing to do. She was not a woman who made rash decisions. She was not easily frightened, and she was not by any stretch someone who caused scenes in public. Which was why, after the service, when members began approaching her with their questions, she genuinely did not know what to say. "Madam Esther, are you all right? Did something happen? Why did you do that? Do you know how it looked? You embarrassed him in front of everyone. The prophet was only trying to help." Her closest friend in the church, a woman named Gloria, pulled her aside near the parking lot and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Esther, I love you, and I am saying this because I love you. You need to go back inside and apologize. People are talking. They're saying you think you're too big for the prophet's prayers. They're saying pride has entered you." Esther looked at her. "Gloria, I cannot explain what happened, but I know what I felt, and what I felt was real." Gloria stared at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head and walked away. Driving home that afternoon, Esther kept one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against her chest, as if she could physically hold on to that small, quiet voice that had spoken to her. She did not feel pride. She did not feel rebellion. She felt something far more unsettling. She felt watched. In the weeks that followed, Esther began paying attention in a way she never had before. Every Sunday service followed the same structure now. Prophet Daniel would begin with scripture, move quickly into a warning about spiritual threats, and then spend the last 40 minutes praying individually over members. The topics never changed: spiritual attacks, family curses, demonic arrows, hidden enemies, ancestral strongholds. The language was always urgent. The atmosphere was always charged with fear, and people came back every single week, desperate for his prayers because the week between Sundays had been difficult again. Someone's contract had fallen through. Someone's child had fallen ill. Someone's husband had grown distant. The prophet always had an explanation, and the explanation always led back to the same solution: come forward, receive prayer, bring your seed offering, and God would fight for you. Esther watched member after member walk to that altar and walk back changed, not in the way that peace changes a person, but in the way that fear changes a person. Their eyes were wider, their grip on their phones was tighter. They spoke in anxious, clipped sentences about things they had seen in dreams, about shadows they felt following them, about enemies they could not name but somehow knew existed. And yet Prophet Daniel's life was transforming in the opposite direction. The rumors began quietly, the way rumors always do. Someone mentioned that he had moved into a new house, not a modest upgrade, but a 6-bedroom property in the most expensive estate in the city. Someone else had seen his new car. Then there were 2 new cars, then a third. His personal assistant had been replaced by a full security detail. A birthday celebration he held for himself had apparently cost more money than most members earned in a year. Esther said nothing to anyone. She simply kept watching. The first dream came on a Thursday night. She was standing inside the church building, but it did not look like a church anymore. It looked like a vast marketplace, stalls everywhere, noise everywhere, the smell of something she could not identify. Members of the congregation were walking in through the main entrance, each one carrying a lamp. The lamps were lit, bright. Some were burning so strongly they seemed to push light in every direction. But as each person walked toward the front, toward the prophet who was standing exactly where the pulpit always stood, the lamp they carried began to dim, slowly at first, then faster. By the time they reached him, the light was barely a flicker, and Prophet Daniel himself grew brighter with every person who approached him, as if he were drawing something from each lamp and keeping it for himself. Esther woke up with her heart hammering.
She sat at the edge of her bed for a long time, telling herself it was only a dream. It meant nothing. She had been thinking too much about the church, and her mind had constructed an image from her anxieties. That was all. Then the second dream came, 4 nights later. This time she saw a tree. Massive, ancient, with roots that spread underground in every direction. She recognized the roots. They had faces. They were the members of the church. Their energy, their resources, their faith, their hope. All of it was traveling upward through the trunk, feeding into the branches, rising to the very top where a single figure sat, drawing it all in. She woke up again, and this time she did not tell herself it meant nothing. She got on her knees and stayed there until the sun came up. The man arrived at her gate on a rainy Wednesday evening. She did not recognize him at first. He was thin, cautious-looking, the kind of man who checks over his shoulder before he speaks. He gave his name as Emmanuel. He had worked in the church's administrative office 3 years ago before quietly leaving without explanation. Esther let him in. She made tea. She sat across from him and waited. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. He told her that Prophet Daniel had not always been the man standing at that pulpit today. 7 years ago, he had been different. Humble, kind, the sort of pastor who visited the sick in hospitals and refused financial gifts from struggling members. Then, after disappearing for about 8 months, he returned. Changed. The power he carried was different. The hunger in his eyes was different. 3 days later, Prophet Daniel came to her house. He arrived unannounced, which unsettled her more than anything else about the visit. He sat in her living room with the confidence of a man who believed he was welcome everywhere. He accepted the water she offered. He smiled warmly. He asked about her business, her health, and her children. Then he said, "God has been speaking to me about you, Esther. He says you have moved out of alignment. There is a special midnight gathering this Friday. Very private. Only a few key members. I believe your presence is essential." "I won't be attending," Esther said. The warmth slowly faded from his face. "I think you misunderstand the importance." "I won't be attending," she repeated. Something shifted in his expression. It lasted less than a second. A flash of something cold and dangerous appeared behind his eyes before the smile returned. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, walked toward the front door. Then he turned one last time. "Be careful, Esther," he said quietly. "Isolation can be very dangerous for a woman in your position." He left. Esther locked the door and stood with her back against it, breathing slowly. She understood with complete clarity that what she had just heard was not pastoral concern. It was a warning. Everything came at once after that. 2 major clients ended their contracts within the same week. 3 senior employees resigned. Her accountant discovered a serious discrepancy in one of her accounts. Problems appeared everywhere she looked. Her youngest sister called and said the family was worried. People were saying Esther had offended a powerful man of God. Maybe she should humble herself before things became worse. Esther did not sleep well. The nightmares became relentless. She lost weight. Some morning she sat at her kitchen table so exhausted she could not immediately find a reason to stand. But she did not go back. Instead, she cleared her schedule and spent 10 days in prayer and fasting. No social media. No unnecessary phone calls. She read her Bible slowly from beginning to end, paying attention to things she had once rushed past. She prayed not for her business to recover, not for money, not for success. She prayed only for clarity, and something began to shift. Not in her circumstances. Those remained difficult, but inside her, the fear that had been pressing against her ribs slowly loosened. Her thinking became clearer. She began to understand something she had not been able to explain before. The voice that had spoken to her in that church had not been the beginning of her troubles. It had been the thing that kept her away from something much worse. The collapse, when it finally came, was not sudden. Former members began speaking. First one, then three, then many more. Stories emerged about money collected for church projects that was never used for those projects. Stories about private prayer sessions people paid huge sums to attend. Stories about mysterious midnight gatherings. Financial investigations were opened. Trusted associates began distancing themselves. 2 members of his inner circle resigned publicly and refused to explain why. His family, once constantly visible at church events, disappeared from public view. Prophet Daniel continued preaching every Sunday. His voice never wavered. His smile never faltered. But the congregation was changing. Empty seats began appearing where packed rows once stood. The people who remained were divided. Some defended him fiercely. Others sat quietly, trying to understand how they had missed something so important for so long. On the final night of her 10-day fast, Esther had one last dream. 2 roads stretched before her. One was wide, beautiful and crowded. People moved along it quickly. The air above it was filled with color, noise, and the scent of something sweet. The other road was narrow, quiet. Only a few people walked there, not because they were uncertain, but because they paid attention to every step. She watched the wide road for a long time. She understood its appeal. It promised success without struggle, belonging without questions, blessings without sacrifice. Then she looked at the narrow road and finally understood what the voice inside her had been trying to tell her all along. 6 months later, Esther's business had recovered, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, the way things recover when built on solid ground. Her peace had returned before the business did. The church had scattered. Some members joined other congregations. Others stepped away from organized religion entirely. A small group began meeting in someone's living room every Sunday. No pulpit, no titles, no offerings. Just people reading scripture together and trying to find their way back to something honest. Esther often thought about that Sunday when she stepped back from the outstretched hand. She had not known exactly what she was refusing. She only knew that something true inside her was saying no, and that had been enough, because the greatest deception is not always found outside the church. Sometimes it walks in wearing vestments and carrying oil. Sometimes it knows your name and the amount of your last offering. Sometimes it stands at a pulpit beneath bright lights and tells you exactly what fear sounds like when it wants to be mistaken for the voice of God. And the only thing that stands between a person and that kind of deception is the quiet, unspectacular, deeply unpopular decision to trust what you know in your own chest. To trust it even when everyone disagrees. To trust it even when standing alone costs you something. Because truth is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes that whisper is the very thing that saves your life.